Hi everyone and welcome. I'm over here at my spreadsheet because a lot of times we'll start here before we head downstairs to feed my worms, and I wanted to just point out really quickly something I hinted at in one of my previous feedings, which was the way I'm going to be feeding my red wigglers from this point forward. My red wigglers, as you can see over here, was the last time that all 5 of those systems were last fed. 10 days ago, this was the group that I had previously been calling my younger group. 8 days ago, these were the bins that I was referring to as my older group, and then only 5 days ago we were checking in individually on my newest red wiggler bin. So I'm rearranging these now. I'm still sticking to the idea of old group, young group, but now the younger group is going to be fed a couple days from now. It's penciled in as being 2 days from now, at which point it'll be 12 days since that last bin was fed. Here too, it'll be 7 days. So that's a couple days from now, but today the plan is to take one of the bins that was categorized as being in the older group and possibly not feed it today. I want to look at that bin since it's already so far received 20 feedings. I'm thinking that last feeding it received, that 20th feeding 8 days ago, which was when the bin was 127 days old, might actually now become its final feeding in its normal composting phase in that part of its life cycle. And I'm going to transition that to kind of a foraging phase, which means no fresh feedings. Let the worms focus on nibbling down all the little scraps of leftover bedding and food and scraps of whatever's in there still, really refining the material into a nice finished product for a while, whatever amount of time that requires. So that means one of the bins that I had previously been considering as being in the younger group is now going to get elevated and be teamed up with the other one that was in the older group. So kind of a rearrangement of which ones are being classified as oldest and youngest, and an elevation of one of the ones that was classified as being older as being no longer in the feeding phase, going off on its own in pursuit of potentially getting harvested someday. So I've got these bins kind of scribbled down here on my little to-do list that I'm going to take with me. So the ones that I'm checking in on are the ones that are right here, and then these down here are the ones that I referred to earlier as the younger group. So the older group at this point, probably 2 of them being fed, 1 of them being categorized as now being in foraging, and just being left to forage. So before I go though, I wanted to really quickly highlight another little development on my spreadsheet, something I had pointed out in the past that I wanted to do and have done a couple times already in the past, which is just what I pointed at here earlier is the future work. In the past, I had always recorded past work, so here I'm trying to sort of schedule the work in advance and map out the requirements for each bin and give it its due on the schedule. And then another thing that I've really been wanting to do for a while are these columns over here on the side. So for some time now, I've been tracking the time that a bin has been in its horizontal migration in order to drive it towards completion. But now I've actually started recording not only that information about its migration, but also the foraging. How long has the bin foraged or has been in foraging phase, and the composting phase. How many days was the bin in that original first composting phase? And here's the details pertaining how many feedings and the interval of how many feedings in between and so on and so forth. So these are just a couple of the new developments I thought I would share with everyone, because a lot of people do express a lot of interest in, in how this spreadsheet's laid out and what it does. And every now and then when I add something new, I just like to bring it to the attention of the viewer. So, all right, everyone, I'm going to go downstairs, but by way of the kitchen, grab some stuff from the freezer to feed with, and let's regroup down there. It's really quick down here on the shelf. It's much easier to see. To point it out 1, 2, 3 is to say this is the bin right here that we're going to check to see if in fact we want to decide that it's foraging. Then we just make that decision, put it back on the shelf and let it continue. Here's the next 2 going in this swervy pattern, continuing down in this pattern here. Those are the 2 that I'm now classifying as being my oldest active bins, and the 2 down here will be the ones going forward will be classified as the 2 younger bins, teaming them up, feeding them 2 days from now. All right, let's get to work. So now this is the one that we're not going to feed if we do in fact come to the determination that I am going to just let it continue foraging as is, meaning let them just pick through whatever's in there, whatever food they can find, little scraps of this and that. They're welcome to it, but nothing new. Ooh, lots of castings on that piece of plastic, and luckily no worms from what I could tell. A lot of times I got to pick off worms. So look at all those nice castings. It's only 8 days ago that we came in here to feed last. But this is a pretty heavily populated bin from what I remember, and it's always fun coming into this bin. I'm not sure how long ago this paper was put out here, but geez, the stuff is tattered. These could have been those bits of paper that I just continued putting back out here in fragments. I don't think that this was a whole piece of paper last time we checked in here. And even though we don't feed, you know, we can certainly leave this for them to pick away at. Little extra carbon source out on the surface. The plastic will stay on too to help the moisture remain in the bin. So when they come up for a sip, they can take a little nibble off that piece of paper if they're hungry. But what I really want them focusing on is any little scraps that, you know, litter the material. You can see some examples of it out here on the far edges, where it's a little bit drier just because of the airflow that gets by the plastic coverings. So whatever food was down the middle when we last fed, I'm sure it's probably still there. And I'm pretty sure that that's where the last feeding would have occurred, because I had transitioned all my red wigglers back into center feeding patterns. For the longest time we were rotating the feeding areas in my red wiggler bins around from corner to corner. Ugh, what the heck. I've just been dealing with mites in a few of my bins, and anytime I see what appears to be mites, and I think that's what we've got here, this kind of bugs me out. I don't know why, but at this point, you know, since no fresh food's going into this bin any longer, the mite activity, I would hope, will start to drop off a little bit with the reduction of food occurring as they continue breaking down whatever remains in here. So it's pretty damp when you pick down deep into it. Whatever that was, that must have been some scrap of the last feeding. Where was that thing? I can't even remember where it was. I did bump into what appeared to be a larger scrap of food, and I thought I'd find a whole bunch more scooping down the middle like that, but ooh, wow. All I'm coming up with is worms here. I may have deliberately used materials in these most recent feedings that I knew would break down more quickly, so that I don't end up with material that's littered with all kinds of stuff. And I mean, whatever this is, I don't even know what this is, but it's so hard. It just feels like a piece of wood or something. Just covered in casting, so I can't even make out what it is. I'm tempted just to pick stuff like this out at this point and not even return it to the bin, because it's never going to get broken down, whatever it is. But yeah, this material looks so fine. Virtually no leftovers. Here too, some sort of a scrap. Oh, here's something. Perhaps a banana peel. Maybe a piece of paper, actually. It's hard to tell. No, I think it's apple peel, come to think of it. Very hard to determine what they are. And you know, since these bins were getting fed in alternating corners every time over the past few months, I suppose that out in the corners there's probably also a chance that there's still leftover bits of food everywhere. Yeah, see, I somehow remember that there's going to be a big chunk of... Yeah, I remember now there was this big chunk of pineapple stuck out here. And I think the other bin that we're going to be feeding, the other one that was teamed up with this one and categorized as being the older of my bins, I believe that one also has a huge chunk of pineapple in it also. But you know, stuff like these stems and these sticks, I don't really see them getting broken down. I can see some of these real thin, lingering bits of the previous feedings breaking down pretty readily over the next coming couple weeks as the worms just pick through and forage whatever they can get out of this bin. But I suppose now would be a good time to pick out anything that just doesn't seem like it has the potential to break down over the next few weeks. I'm also questioning whether I might want to allow this bin to start aerating a little bit and ventilating some of its excess moisture. A lot of times I like to keep things pretty damp in the bin to promote a lot of worm activity near the surface, because I feel like maybe the material in the bin on the surface is still not as broken down as it could be. But to me it seems like the material out on the surface of this bin, pretty much everywhere in the bin, is quite broken down. So I think for now I probably will just return the plastic covering to it the way we found it, so that the moisture level can remain fairly high in here. But at some future point we might start to initiate the drying of this material in this bin by excluding the plastic covering on it. I'm just thinking, since we've already gone this far to sort of agitate and aerate and inspect the material, we might as well follow through, and if we find any more large chunks of stuff that seems unlikely to break down, maybe pull it out and just set that stuff aside and place that stuff into bins where there's probably a better chance of it breaking down, since there's a whole bunch of time remaining in those bins before they would get harvested. But here too, the shell of an avocado, that's not going to get broken down between now and the anticipated harvesting of this system. Because if I'm already foraging and I forage for, say, a month, at that point, you know, it's a bin full of really hungry worms that are pretty heavily motivated to move out if you offer them a nice tasty treat, like in a baiting area or some sort of a feeding zone. So yeah, I think this is a good way to kind of make foraging official, is to take out all those large chunks of material that would distract them from picking away at the really puny stuff. And then you really feel like you've kind of kicked foraging into gear, so to speak. But you could tell everywhere you pick, there's lots and lots of worms. And that's got a lot to do, I believe, with the fact that this bin was getting fed all around the bin, all around the corners, going around and around. So every corner probably has tons of leftover scrap food remaining in it that the worms can keep busy with for the next few weeks. So yeah, this stuff here, I'm taking it out. I'll just set it aside and I'll include it in the feeding of one of my younger red wiggler bins, perhaps the youngest of the red wiggler bins, next time we check in on them. I just happen to have this piece of paper towel here. I can sort of bundle this little package, care package, to go over into that system. And in fact, I'll put it right on that system now. And that'll be a better place for that sort of stuff to be, where it's going to have ample time to break down. And, you know, in future check-ins, if we come back in here to see how things are progressing over the coming weeks, we can do the same thing. We can till the material around, help it aerate, pick out any large stuff that seems like it's not going to get broken down anytime soon, and put it somewhere else where it has a better chance of breaking down. So I think technically now, as of that last feeding 8 days ago, this bin is now officially in foraging mode. And we've even helped the foraging mode a little bit, I believe, by excluding some of those larger food scraps in there that could distract them from focusing on all the little tiny stuff that we want them picking away at. Okay, very nice. Such a cool bin. Such a very productive bin too, because of all the worms in it. All right, let's go check the next bin. Now with this system, even though I classify it as being red wigglers, I know that it's a mix of red wigglers and a number of other types of worms in here. Sometimes I get suspicious that cardboard is the reason flying insects hang out. And this piece of cardboard is just covered in mating flying insects. These are all 2 flying insects connected back to back in the process of mating. Huh. Ugh. Okay, something we don't want to have happening, I think, in our wormery. So looks like this bin has found its found its new function of being sort of a little flying insect nursery. I'm not sure what the cause of that is. I wonder if it could have something to do with the fact that there's this sort of unique item on here. I usually don't cover up using a piece of towel. I usually cover up with paper or something like that. But I figured let's try the towel. I want to get a closer look at these things. I think I'm going to break out my phone's camera and we're going to see if we can get a tight zoom in on what these little guys are. I don't know what they are. They just don't appear to be your typical potworm. Usually, you know, you think of potworms as being the little white worms that you find in your worm bins, but these are somehow larger, I think. To me, a potworm is something that's much, much smaller. Over here, too, it looks like we've got the fragment of a busted up worm. It's another weird thing we've only been seeing in this bin is little chunks of broken worm here and there. And I already saw a couple too before when we first got into this bin. So, all right, well, let's continue. Let's pull this covering off and let's get to feeding this bin. I can't even remember. It might have been one of my other bins where I know I've got towels and pine cones and other weird stuff down within the material. Here I believe the towel was really only serving the purpose of sort of top cover. We might have to just do away with that if it does appear to be the cause of various unusual things going on, such as flying insects and weird white worms hanging out in the system. Might be time to return this bin to a more conventional setup as opposed to trying new stuff like that towel on top. Well, they gotta admit the towel on top definitely produces a huge amount of moisture. I don't know if it's, no, I can't say that. The towel's not causing the moisture, but the towel, I don't know, I guess sucks a lot of the moisture into it and just holds it there right above this material, allowing this material to really soak it in. Here too, every time I see a little jumble of white dots, to me that's mites. And I understand mites being in a bin and, you know, them serving this purpose right here that you see is them breaking down dead worms. They're kind of the cleanup crew and they serve that function excellently. But I don't want to have bins that are just, you know, riddled with mites. So is that worm actually moving? I thought that was a dead worm and that it was maybe being consumed by the mites. But maybe I'm mistaken. I thought I saw the worm move. Because if it is alive, then it seems to be, yeah, that damaged chunk of it is where the action is. All the mites are gobbling it up. Must be one of those broken worms. Ooh, squeaky. Down here we've got, this is that other corner where I knew I had fed pineapple chunks, large ones. I had actually fed pineapple chunks in this corner in all my red wiggler bins, but it was only in these two that I had really large chunks. The other one that we're going to feed her a little later, if we end up in that same corner over here, there would have been pineapple placed there too. That would have been maybe 2 or 3 feedings ago. But it would have been small chunks, which may have by this time been broken down already. Wow, tremendous amount of moisture in here. I think it is probably a good idea to exclude the plastic covering off of here. Give this bin a little chance to dry off. And I think I'm just trying to decide whether that plastic being removed is enough to help. Perhaps meaning that we could put that towel back on, but with only a piece of paper covering it, it'll allow for a lot more of its moisture to be released into the air. Just like to make small changes, and maybe if we're going to do that, we can, yeah, kind of get rid of the plastic but keep the towel. But the towel won't be as soaking wet in future check-ins because it'll be covered only by a piece of newspaper, allowing for drying. All right, I'm thinking that this is just a good opportunity to sort of till up all the material in here, especially since we're going to be excluding the plastic covers and wanting to try to promote the drying of the material in here a little bit. So let's just follow suit with that through the entire contents of the container. Just try to get a quick stir on here. I think by doing this, we're pretty much negating the whole concept of where previous feedings had occurred by kind of stirring everything around at this point. Kind of removes the temptation of wanting to go back to see how those previous feedings are progressing. All right, but also creating good air gaps everywhere for allowing this material to release some of its moisture to the air. Okay, so I've got this food for them, which, since it's an older bin, I figured I would use some of this chopped up material as food today. It would certainly not leave leftovers for long. All the bits and pieces of stuff in there was chopped up with the food processor, creating almost kind of like a slurry of food for them. And I think it's also a little bit drier than a lot of the food that they get, because I usually put in just straight foods that are frozen, and that includes all the moisture that's included in those foods. Here, the moisture that had collected from the materials all being blended up, a lot of it I drained off. So I believe that this is much drier material than if it had just been placed in here whole. So it's a pretty generous feeding, as you could tell, but it's not the end of it, because I'm going to include a little bit of grit to go with that food, as well as a nice mound of coffee on top. So this is definitely a generous feeding for this bin. But you saw how many worms are in here. There's a lot of worms in here. I think they're going to have no problem breaking down this stuff, especially since it's all nice fine chopped material. Fine chopped and frozen. Look at the size of this thing. I keep wondering if that's the same big fat worm we keep bumping back into each time we come in here. Alright. Interesting bin. So since there's no plastic going back to cover things up here, I gotta find a piece of newspaper that we can cover up with. But let's first return this topper. Oh yeah. This paper was just showing us where we last fed. We could return it to that same function. Times like this, I wish I was using both hands. It would make the work a little bit easier. Trying to spread something out with one hand, but I'm getting pretty good at it. A lot of practice. Okay, let me go fetch a piece of paper from somewhere. Luckily, I've replenished my newspaper supplies. And at this point, we're going to be covering up with newspaper only. That should help a lot with the moisture situation in here. Yeah, here we go. This is a piece of paper I've been wanting to use in my worm bins for a while now. It's a piece of paper that I picked up off my front yard. The wind had just blown it onto my property. And I figured, you know what? I could use this old piece of paper, this weathered piece of paper, as covering in some of my worm bins. So the plastic that we used as covering, that's sitting over here on the side. And you know what? I'm going to also leave off this cardboard covering, because I'm wondering if the cardboard might also be contributing to the flying insects hanging out here and making themselves comfortable. So I think besides trying to dry things off, we're also going to see if that results in fewer flying insects. I sure hope it does. It'd be nice. All right, one more bin to feed. Okay. This leads us to the last bin that we're going to be feeding today. Very similar setup, as you can see. Hopefully no bugs here. This looks a little bit more like what I'm used to seeing with a piece of paper right there below the plastic, not a towel. And a whole bunch of worms hanging out on it, no broken worms. We didn't see worms hanging out on the towel. I don't know, maybe it's just something about that towel that they're not really considering to be very comfortable or whatever the case may be. This piece of paper, I kind of knew already last week. There's so little holding it together anymore. I'm wondering if it's worth the effort to try to prevent it from tearing. What the heck? It's still one piece, right? Let's keep it that way. It's like a little challenge to try to keep the paper in here from ripping, especially when it starts to show significant signs of wear. It just becomes that much trickier. Alright, and this stuff's all damp, so I mean, they should be okay for a few minutes while we're feeding here. If we just rest it off on the side. I could definitely see the signs of some, you know, depletion of material. Here too, we would have fed down the middle at this point in all of my red wiggler bins. We could already see a little depression underneath where the feeding was applied. You might have noticed we didn't apply any fresh bedding with my last system that I just fed. Food only, as well as a little bit of grit. But here, I think this bin has still got a little bit of more age left to it. So I don't really see any harm in maybe including a little bit of fresh bedding with this bin. But it too is kind of getting to that point, you know, in age where we might want to start withholding fresh bedding and letting them really break down what's in here already. Because everywhere you look, you know, there's pieces of paper, leaves, lots of little chunks of cardboard everywhere. This bin is still riddled with tons and tons of bedding, and you know, lots of bedding is good in your system. So adding a little bit more won't do any harm. But at some point I will want to start, you know, withholding the addition of fresh bedding from my older bins. This way you end up with less of this stuff littering your finished compost. So I can't see anything that really resembles what might have been the last feeding. I wonder if the last feeding might have been just some stuff that breaks down really quickly. If I really wanted to, I could just salvage little bits of bedding and paper and scraps and stuff like that from elsewhere and use it underneath my feedings. But today we're going to apply a little bit of fresh bedding with today's feeding. Could be one of the last applications of fresh bedding for this system. So let's see. A couple of these coffee filters, one of them had already torn open up in the kitchen. So we'll use one of them here. And the other one right there. That's another nice generous portion of bedding to go with this feeding. This bin's getting the same stuff. A couple of these chunks of frozen, ground up, processed kitchen scraps. It's in large part, I believe, celery, from what I remember. A whole bunch of grapes. So there's all kinds of really good stuff in here. Worms are really going to love this. And I got a feeling it is not going to be showing any signs of leftovers since it's already minuscule little bits of stuff. I mean, right now it's frozen together in a chunk, but you know, you could probably imagine that it's just a whole bunch of tiny particles, basically. All right, we'll spread this coffee around, and we're done. I just figured we would leave the outer edges for last. Maybe we would pile on to cover up the feeding, but at the same time we would try to maybe aerate some of this material out on the sides and bring it up from the bottom, because a lot of it seemed pretty damp when I first started probing down in this corner over here. A lot of moisture, but not as much in this corner. I just thought that this corner that I first poked into would really be representative of the rest of the system. This is a big banana bunch stem, where a whole bunch of the stems are hanging off of. Here's some recycled paper bits from previous feedings. Here we can really see the signs of some of the older pocket feedings here too. The pocket feeding would have nestled the food portion into this little piece of paper for them. And there's some of the pineapple even. Pineapple eventually goes. I think it just takes a little while since it is citrus based food. It might just take a little while for the acids to sort of dissolve or neutralize or whatever the case may be, and then the worms can get at it. So, whatever. We'll see how the moisture is on these outer corners as well. Definitely not as much, because I guess going back, this would have been older and older, and yet even older, and even the oldest feedings going back in time, because the last corner feeding happened in that corner, so you go back counterclockwise. So it's not surprising that the material in these corners is not quite as damp. And definitely seeing fewer scraps of bedding and food over here too. Alright. Pretty nice looking bin. I forget the age. We were looking at it in the spreadsheet earlier, but it's not yet reached 100 days of age yet. So it's still got some ways to go, I think, before we might want to start considering gearing it up for harvest at some point. So there's lots of bedding in here, lots of food scraps. So this bin will be with us for quite some time going forward, I believe. All right, so all that's left to do here is to put things away. And now that I come to think of it, moisture in this bin is pretty much perfect. Now that I've sort of equalized some of the more dry stuff with the more damp stuff, there's really no reason for concern here. It was just a little bit of excessive moisture in that first corner that I began prodding around in. Kind of got me startled, maybe because of the high level of moisture we saw in the other bins that we just checked on, but here we're good. I'm not going to sweat it. I'm going to keep it at this dampness level, which means I'm going to be restoring these plastic coverings that prevent the moisture from escaping. So I do believe it helps a lot, and it creates a really cozy environment for the worms. Pretty good fit, right? All right, well, that's it, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Before I put all this stuff away and go get cleaned up, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a quick thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing for the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Take care.